for having me.
Thank you so much, Steffi. Thanks a lot. And before we start, I just wanted to thank Steffi and the extraordinary team here at DLD. It's so very, very exciting every year to have this series of emerging artists. And we started 15 years ago with very early talks here by Olafur Eliasson. And very often the idea...
But Hans Ulrich is the connection maker, the discoverer, and he's not doing it in a business-oriented way. He's doing it in a empathic curiosity way. And this is what we all need: an empathy and curiosity, the combination. You can't be good in a business without empathy, without curiosity. This is one of the qualities of our time, and he's the incarnation.
The real connection maker is Steffi, because what then happens is, once the artists are here, many connections happen at DLD, beyond boundaries of disciplines. It's so urgent that we break down silos in the 21st century, which still exist. And to give you an example, last year, thanks to Steffi bringing us here together, we had Katharina Grosse give a talk, and Katharina met in one of the famous DLD coffee breaks Alexander Kluge, and they've now done an exhibition together and an opera together. So the idea is really that so many projects emerge after DLD. And as Steffi always says, it's also about patterns that connect. And it's fascinating that making many studio visits this year, actually, and it's a conversation we had with Claude Agile, curator at the Serpentine, who is here also. We had a conversation about this importance of poetry, because both Claude and I observed, going to many studios, how many visual artists actually, at the moment, also work with poetry. And that's, in a way, without us even planning it, it happens to be that all the artists who we're going to actually introduce to you today have either a practice as poet or also write poetry. And so we will have in each panel a very special poetry reading, and Tao is going to read us a poem today. But Tao, of course, is foremost a visual artist, and I saw the extraordinary studio in Toronto, actually, late last year. These amazing sculptures Tao is going to tell us more about. So please give a very, very warm welcome to Tao Lewis.
Thank you.
And Tao, I wanted to begin with the beginning and actually ask you how it all began, because it seems that there was an awakening with Chloe Weiss, and I kind of wanted to know how you came to art, or how art came to you.
This is like very early days when I was first kind of figuring out that I didn't want to continue with post-secondary school. Chloe and I both lived in Toronto at that time, and I think maybe more than like a creative awakening, it was sort of this believing, or I guess meeting someone who made me feel as though I could have the same kind of self-directed narrative. And it's interesting because I was having this conversation with my assistant recently about comparing yourself in the art world to other people and whether I do that and whether that's a good thing. And I think it is a really important thing because it helps you kind of visualize where you want to be, who you want to position yourself with. So I think at that time, even though we were coming from extremely different backgrounds, it was good for me to meet someone who had the kind of self-direction as Chloe. So yeah, it was very inspiring for me in that way.
And writing has always been there, because you started actually as a journalist, and as I said, we think really poetry is so important now. And when Steffi, asks, what do you add? I think the amazing thing is to add poetry to our world. And your writing skills began really with journalism, but you then came soon to poetry. And you told me this morning that you feel that we have so much information, so much also traumatic information, and that we kind of need to find a better way to process it. And that's maybe poetry. So I was curious about writing, how you came to poetry, and maybe who are the poets who inspire you?
I think, we have to find better ways to process words and language. Poetry came before journalism for me, so I think creative writing was my strength. I went into journalism school not understanding how dry and strict journalistic writing was, which is why it didn't work for me. but it's still a huge part of what I do. I normally have a notebook that becomes an archive of writing, ideas, thoughts, which I then keep. I don't share them, but I'll reference that writing, to write texts about the work, to find titles for exhibitions and stuff like that. But it's important for me to document that process through words as I'm making the artwork. And the poems, they're sort of like love letters. They usually have a bit of humor in them. I write them for the artworks.
And you actually brought us a poem, so maybe we could read the poem, because very often also exhibitions are accompanied by poems. You wrote, for example, at the Night Gallery in 2019, an amazing poet, actually, about a conductor.
Yeah.
Today you're going to read as an unpublished poem.
This one is published as well, but it's about a black hole. So most of the poems are dedicated, as I said, to the artworks, to the ancestors, spirits. So this is called I Heard a Heartbeat Down in the Black Hole. It's my first time reading a poem live since high school. I heard a heartbeat down in the black hole. I've been hovering above the giant quicksand fields of darkness, sitting on this little light beam of mine. I've been looking down, past the doorsteps of the ghost of space and time, and the gravitational gateway of goneness, staring into the heaviest, mightiest black. When I listen hard, I can hear a pulsational sound, something like a heartbeat. Did you keep on keeping on, friend, in that blind castaway place? Some place we thought living couldn't be, and seeing couldn't see. Some place so blind and black and beyond, there would be no saving we. That old flag still down on my flagpole. But I swear I can almost hear some mechanism of some rhythm coming from way down in that black hole. My heart's in the bright place, so I'm uncurling my rope of hope. I'll hope long and hard to stretch this rope past time so I can climb down to you. I've never been very scared of ghosts and such. If we don't come out, I hope you'll love me enough to teach me to see in the blindness. And I'll still love you if you've changed. Sometimes we need to transform to understand life better.
Thank you so much. A big round of applause for Paul.
Thank you.
And of course, poetry plays an important role, but as I mentioned, you're foremost a sculptor.
Yeah.
So I kind of was wondering, if you can tell a little bit about how you came to sculpture, because when I started to see your work, you already had found your language, and you do these extraordinary, they're almost like personas. One of them actually travels with you very regularly, goes on journeys with you. Can you tell us about these characters, these personas?
They all come from different imaginary places. When I'm in my studio, I try to remain in the imaginary. So a lot of the time, I'm referencing geographies that are make-believe, but I'm also taking a lot of inspiration from stories and from people in my personal life. I make things about memory in a lot of ways. I like to think that I make portraits of landscapes because the materials literally that I'm making the objects are from different landscapes. So they kind of encompass all of these things.
And talking about the imaginary, when we were in the studio, you've described the imaginary to me as certain art objects or mythologies, and how these can be just as useful a theory, the sciences, or can even be considered a technology. And so it's kind of interesting, no? Because we're here in a conference which addresses a lot the connection to technology, if we consider a technology as the application of a specific knowledge to find answers or solve a problem, then we understand the mobility of people, and also, as you mentioned, the erasures of certain histories. So I was sort of curious if you could elaborate a little bit about the imaginary in these characters and the link to technology.
Yeah, I think the imaginary is truth, and I think a lot of the time it becomes a tool when there's no other tool at your disposal. And basically what I meant by that, describing the imaginary as truth, describing art objects and mythologies as just as important as the sciences or theory. In my personal experience, I'm very interested in studying, let's say, the outsider artwork of the American South, the Black South. Those objects to me, which came from post-slavery era and were made largely out of debris and refuse and garbage, a lot of these objects I would consider fossils that contain the DNA, the emotional, generational DNA of an entire community. So I think by studying certain art objects, by studying certain tendencies towards myth-making in the Black community, we can really learn a lot about mobility, and we can learn about pictorial memory and trauma and how to recover. So that was kind of what I meant by that statement.
And you have a drawing actually in your studio of this extraordinary outsider artist from Miami.
Purvis Young, yeah.
Yeah, Purvis Young, whom I actually met. He was very old at the time. He sadly passed away. He was an extraordinary, very prolific outsider artist. Can you tell us about your passion for him?
Yeah, I think that I have a really great connection to this branch of artwork that Purvis Young belongs to. My greatest inspiration in life and in art is the artist Lonnie Hawley. I had the chance of meeting Lonnie in Atlanta in 2018. And it sort of occurred to me then, seeing Souls Grown Deep Foundation and seeing just the massive amount of objects, which, sadly, are very undervalued up until now, which we can learn so much from and which have really kind of lent so much to contemporary art in a vast amount of ways. But I get asked a lot what the connection is between myself and, say, an artist like Purvis Young or like Lonnie Hawley, because I'm Canadian and I come from Canada. But we do have threads of a similar narrative across geographies. And I think where we really find ourselves connecting is in our tendency towards myth-making and collecting and archiving and trying to sort of create something different out of a circumstance.
Yeah, it was very fascinating for me to be in Toronto to make studio visit. Not only did I discover an extraordinary art scene there, but it was also really interesting to see to which extent there is also a real visibility, for example, of First Nation artists, which is much less visible in many other countries in the world. Now, one thing we also discussed when we were in your studio was the materials you use to do this sculpture. And one material you spoke about was hair. You very often use human hair, your own hair, but also the hair of your very close friends. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about this, and I was wondering, it seems almost like a spiritual process.
Yeah, I mean, historically, it's a spiritual process. You can find human hair in a lot of art objects coming out of Africa, a lot of Yoruba masks, human teeth as well. But if you look at the structure of hair, African hair, the coil, when this structure is found in nature, it's something that's meant to grab onto things and hold on to things. And as the hair grows out of the head, it's holding on to information, it's holding on to emotional things, it's holding on to trauma, it's holding on to ideas. All of those things are very much attached to the hair as a material. And so part of the reason why I use hair sometimes, as well as other personal belongings, as well as things like seashells that come from the earth, they really do hold on to a charge. I think one of the most interesting things about using found materials is that they've had their own life prior to me repurposing them, and they hold on to those histories, these affective histories. And that's part of what creates a very visceral experience for me when I'm looking at the artworks, of Lonnie Hawley or these kind of assemblage works of found objects.
What these practices also have in common, and I remember Purvis Young telling me about this, is this idea of healing, art as the artist as a healer, and that's very urgent in the current situation of the world and the extinction crisis, the idea of healing. And we did a show at the Serpentine of Emma Kunz, who was actually the first artist I came across as a child, because when I was like 3, 4, 5 years old, my mother would always buy this powder called Ion, and it's a powder you can find in every Swiss pharmacy, by this artist healer, Emma Kunz, who discovered the radiating qualities of a specific stone. And it can be used, for humans. One can drink it. One can also use it as a cream. And one can also give it to plants. It's really an incredible range of application this powder has. And of course, on the package, there is a little drawing by this outsider artist, Emma Kunz, who a bit like, Hilma af Klint, came to abstraction through these healing, diagrams. And so I've always been very, very interested, because that's how I came to art. Because on this package, my mother bought, there was a little drawing by Emma Kunz, and I thought it was very beautiful. I wanted to know more. And then a whole chain reaction started, and then soon after I came from there to Giacometti, and then from Giacometti to Fischli Weiss. But I remember that you also talk about healing, and I was very interested in how you see these sculptures in a way connected to healing.
It's very slow art, the process. It's very, very slow. I don't use any sewing machines. I work with one assistant, and we hand stitch everything. The plaster pieces in the artwork are hand carved. In one respect, I'm very interested in how I can honor and continue diasporic practices of art making, which would have been very labor intensive and would have been very focused on recycling, imparting your own energy onto the object. There's a huge transference of energy that you give to an object when you spend so much time physically with it. The same is true of when you make a painting. But I spend a lot of time on top of, wrapped up in, and handling the fabrics that I work with. And this
like
is
the fabrics here, for example, right?
Yeah. So this is entirely hand-stitched, and it took up the entire floor of my studio. And it's an absolute delight for me to be able to spend a certain amount of time with the object before it goes into a space where it's going to be consumed. And these are all parts of the labor, which is a labor of love. I think there can be negative connotations associated with labor, and it's not always the case.
But you talk about limitations also, and of course, there's this whole poetry movement in France, the Oulipo movement, where they made poetries out of constraints. For example, one couldn't, with Perec, use the letter E. He wrote an entire novel where he wasn't allowed to use the letter E. And he found kind of magic in that limitation, which leads us to the title of this talk. And I was interested in further relating kind of to these many possibilities within, creative work, despite limited resources or limiting circumstances, as you say. And so I was kind of wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that, because it connects to labor, how it sort of connects to the idea of artistic production as a form of labor, and the magic in limitations. I want to hear you talk about the magic in limitations.
Yeah, I think when you are creating anything out of a limiting circumstance, limited resources, limited access to materials, it forces you to engage with certain mental muscles that you might otherwise not have to. It's the pressure that creates the diamond. And I think that if you look historically across most forms of Black cultural production, the main backbone is always an upcycling of a circumstance. Hip-hop, jazz music, objects, everything is about kind of working with what you have in order to create something different or something generative from maybe a situation that might not be so fruitful or generative. So that's what the title of the conversation is sort of referencing. And for, the most part, my practice is really grounded in just using what's available to me. And I think that that's kind of helped me to work harder to understand materials and understand why I'm making and what I'm making.
And we also thought that that is such an interesting answer in a way to, Steffi's question at this year's DLD, what do you add? So it's not necessarily, only adding new objects, but it's in a way reusing. It's very connected, your practice, to recycling, or as you say, upcycling, which is somehow the backbone of the work. And we see that in all these works, but I was curious, what's next? What are you working on right now?
A lot.
Can you tell us about what excites you most?
The main obsession of mine right now is fabric. Because as I said, recycling is very important. the theme of the conference, what are you adding, this is a question that I'm literally asking myself in the studio every day with regards to my material practice. Not just what are you adding, but like, how can you not add so much? And I don't think that art professionals and artists should be exempt from the conversation about the environment, given that we are huge perpetrators. If we look at the waste that is produced by art fairs and artistic production and jet emissions. So for me, this is a daily consideration. I take donations of fabric. I score secondhand stores to see what things I can get for free, and I figured out that fabric is something that I can travel with. So it's a wonderful way to collect things as I'm traveling. The fabric is always different depending on what landscape you're in. So quilt making is really important to me right now. I'm going to be doing a group show at the Hammer coming up in the fall. I have a solo exhibition at my gallery, Cooper Cole, in Toronto, also in the fall. And I open a museum show actually next week in Toronto at Oakville.
And it will be fascinating in LA because, of course, the cloth making connects also to Lucita Hurtado, the artist we showed at the Serpentine, who is turning 100 years old, actually 100 years young, this year. And Lucita hasn't bought actually any clothes for more than 70 years. It's all been reusing and designing her own clothes. Now, I know we are out of time. I have many more questions. I think it's also interesting to think of these sculptures as time capsules in terms of the reusing thing. But I wanted to end with my only recurrent question, which is always particularly interesting at DLD because of the interdisciplinarity. There's very often afterwards actually a realization. When I ask here Rem Koolhaas about his unrealized project many years ago, he said he wanted to do a school, and somebody in the audience said, let's do it, and then Strelka was born. So I'm asking the question of the unrealized project of artists, not only to keep it unrealized, but to actually find solutions that we can realize these artist dreams. And there are, of course, many possibilities why an artist project is unrealized. Some projects are too big, some are too small, some projects are utopic, they're simply non-realizable. Some projects are censored. And then, as Doris Lessing always told me, there is also the self-censor projects, the projects we haven't dared to do. So I was wondering if you could tell us maybe about one specific unrealized project you would love to do, a dream.
I'm writing a sci-fi.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm obsessed with sci-fi. I feel like as I continue to make these works, they're part of an unfolding narrative that may not ever be complete. But it's been really fun for me getting to write about them, getting to see them be realized. So it may not actually happen for another 30, 40, maybe never. But I feel as I'm working, I'm writing a sci-fi with my artworks.
Tao, thank you so very much. Thanks a lot. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.